Thanks, Brett. Thanks, Dale. How does it work? Does it just fire off and then... Okay. So, yes, I'm Adam, and I'm an artist filmmaker researching how video art can borrow strategies from early Renaissance polyptics, these movable multi-panel paintings, to make multi-screen video art installations that explore the complexities of climate change. But tonight I want to talk about how the very particular dimensions of climate change require new representational approaches. Showing an image of a forlorn polar bear on an ice floe doesn't really help us grasp, I think, what is a multidimensional problem, nor its potential solutions. Also, we need to acknowledge that as cultural workers, we're embedded in the problem and find ways to approach this without hypocrisy, greenwashing, or losing sight of the bigger picture. We're all aware of the fossil fuel footprint of the art world. I'm very mindful of it as a documentary filmmaker, since my video art practice means I regularly film in distant places. That said, this is the remains of a coal mine cableway 1,300 kilometres from the North Pole in Svalbard. Svalbard's unique because usually climate change has cause and effect. Here you have climate change cause and effect in close proximity. For example, this coal mine directly opposite a retreating glacier in Pyramiden. But climate change is usually characterised by a very strong dislocation of cause and effect. And our brains aren't particularly evolved to cope with these kind of threats. A projector lamp in Sydney maybe causes a coal plant in the Hunter to work a little bit harder, producing an extra 5 kilograms of CO2, which 30 years hence contributes to the nation of Tuvalu's eventual engulfment. And that's where my story began, because I shot, as Dale mentioned, in Tuvalu in 2003, just as the islanders were beginning to understand that their island was disappearing. And that shoot brought out my frustrations with traditional documentary approaches, reliance on visible evidence, when climate change is actually caused by gases we can't usually see and displaced in time and space. Unfortunately, the ABC was beset by Howard government's climate wars, and in 2003, their insistence on applying this false notion of balance to climate science eventually kiboshed the film I was making, and they bought the Great Global Warming Swindle instead. So I turned to video art, since video artists didn't seem to have to put up with this kind of nonsense. They were free to push boundaries, take poetic and creative approaches to documentary. Suddenly it wasn't about giving people more information, but a completely different level of effect. Mind you, the single most galvanising strategy for climate action still has to be the direct experience of its effects. And for me, that was filming in Piazza San Marco as it disappeared underwater in late 2019, almost drowned. For some Australians, I think, though, that choking on bushfire smoke in their own urban house a few months later was perhaps the moment when they made those emotional, intellectual and sensorial interconnections to each their own climate epiphany. I missed that because I was up here in Svalbard working on a solo exhibition, and these avalanches on the left here stopped just short of the gallery and the residents and forced authorities to abandon most of this upper town. It's warming 7 times faster than the global average up here. That was March 2020, the same month that Australia closed its borders, and I ended up marooned in the Arctic for the next 2 years. But back to this problem of engendering empathy. Here you see 15th century early Renaissance polyptics, these folding panels on the left, and their contemporary multi-screen video art descendants there on the right. So these painters faced a similar problem, how to bring abstract ideas, Christianity based on events long ago in the Middle East, into relevance in contemporary Flemish lives. They developed a whole suite of visual strategies to make these connections, and their multi-panel works ask the viewer to mentally bridge spatio-temporal gaps located in the physical gaps between the images. So my practice-led research looks at multi-screen video montage to do something similar, to help audiences fill in the gaps of experience by completing these representational ellipses, especially if they're standing in those gaps, because then they start to become kind of embodied in those ideas. And this can be helpful because of the difficulties our senses, I think, have in correlating the dislocated phenomenology of climate change. And that 5-screen work you saw just before was actually powered by a petrol generator just outside, rather than tacitly accept that there would be displaced carbon pollution 200 kilometres away to power it. It was smelly, it was noisy, and that was the point, really. I bought 8 carbon offsets for 8 litres of fuel and displayed it next to it as an indulgence certificate. In the early Renaissance, you could buy indulgence certificates from the church to offset your moral transgressions. The main difference was they were papal indulgences, mine were PayPal indulgences. Likewise, selecting offset your flights when flying always felt too simplistic to me. It was like greenwashing. Offsets don't prevent carbon being entering the atmosphere or from having an effect. They allow rich people and institutions to continue being bad global citizens, or bad ancestors, as Roman Krasnarek might say. A climate scientist who refuses to fly once said to me, "You're paying poor people to die for you." With this in mind, I decided that next time I'd put myself in a direct relationship with the offsets and plant the trees myself. So in 2019, when Facebook flew me around the world to talk about my research into vertical image making to their staff at their global headquarters, before I left, I spent 2 exhausting days planting 149 trees, Eucalyptus viminalis, on degraded land in my parents' farm in the Snowies. These trees now have to be cared for, not burned down, for the next 100 years to sequester that 9.9 tonnes of CO2. But I don't want to individualise our responsibility for the climate crisis to the point where we start to overlook systemic economic root causes of the problem. Let's not forget that the term carbon footprint was coined by PR consultants for BP in about 2004 to try to take the heat off institutional carbon and dump it on individuals. Even a homeless person in the USA would have an 8.5 tonne carbon footprint because they're embedded in the fossil fuel system. I'm particularly interested in flying and Flugskam, flying shame, because A, I was doing a fair bit of it, and B, in 2018, only 11% of the world's population took a flight and only 4% flew internationally. So it's a symbol of what's been termed the colonialism of the environment. It's fundamentally unjust. And aviation emissions are the undercurrent of my 8-minute video, which you'll see in a minute. The work was born from a formula about sea ice loss published in the peer-reviewed journal Science in 2016. Previously, I'd known about climate attribution science. You know, an event might be X times more likely because of anthropogenic climate change. But suddenly, with a 10% margin for error, Knotts and Strove's formula allows you to calculate how much sea ice will be lost per tonne of CO2 that you emit. This is me at the Upernavik Museum's residency in Greenland. A return economy seat there from Sydney totalled 5.23 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. It's a lot, and it's because jets are pumping greenhouse gases directly into the stratosphere. You have to use a good carbon calculator if you want to take this into account. For example, I'd recommend atmosphere.de. Put that into this formula, and that 5.23 tonnes works out at 15.69 square metres of sea ice that I effectively destroyed by going there. And it won't regenerate in the autumn, and that extra bit of dark open water will absorb more heat and melt more ice in the future. So I'm going to break the presentation, sorry that was a bit breakneck, for 8 minutes to show this work, Anthropocene 4 Delta Area Sea Ice, adrift Delta Area Sea Ice, and then I'll come back for my last 4 slides. And I should mention that it's the split screen version that you'll be seeing here. It's been shown as the original triptych in the Waterhouse Prize in Canberra and Adelaide, and the audio that you'll hear, as well as the rain, is aeolian sounds that the wind made in my water tank while I was living there. That was me trying to look calm as I was flying a drone with frozen fingers waiting for the narwhal hunter who dropped me there to come and pick me up again. I'm making this work, which hasn't actually been shown in New South Wales, if anybody's interested. I wanted to get a sense of the disconnects operating in my own psychology, the cognitive dissonances that I could rely upon to kick in every time I light the fireplace or fill the car or take a flight. Theorist Timothy Morton calls global warming a hyperobject. It occupies time and space beyond human perception. We find ourselves trapped within the phenomenon we're trying to observe. So philosophically and artistically, we need new tools and approaches. My video triptych, Feeling the Heat, uses thermographic thermographic heat cameras borrowed from climate scientists, many of whom feel hamstrung by the kinds of scientific codes of dispassionate observation, unable to speak out. And by anonymizing them, they were felt able to speak about their emotional response as citizens of the planet. So in my works, I'm trying varying extrasensorial approaches: infrared fast motion, reverse slow motion, time shifting, linking cause and effect across past, present and future, like in this work, which is a video triptych about geoengineering, specifically carbon capture and storage. I'm interested in how art can extend our sensorium, decenter the human perspective. Drones are very useful for that. Deal with non-human timescales and create myths and stories about new ways of living, speculating about alternative futures. As a postscript, this is from a shoot I was colour grading on the weekend about a dying glacier, and I've been struggling all weekend with what you might call the apocalyptic sublime. Unlike Hollywood, I don't want to make destruction visually pleasurable, but I keep hitting my head on this problem that only via its outcomes do we see climate change most strongly, and by then it's too late. So I hope images like that, even if they somehow work on our emotions, might play some small part in preparing the way for the kind of dramatic transformations that are upon us. And ultimately, it's those transformations that will be the story that's of most interest to future generations, I think. Thank you.